Solo Leveling by Gong. Chapter 11 Part 3 The Potential Jackpot. After sending the text, Jin-Woo scanned his surroundings. Not a soul nearby. He was currently in the woods, as he'd chosen an infrequently visited hillside for sake's sake. It was currently 5:44 p.m., so he didn't expect any hikers at this hour. Plus, he'd picked a spot off the beaten path. Shall I get going? Jin-Woo accessed his inbox. Would you like to accept the job change quest? Y/N, the message popped up like it had been waiting for him. Gulp. Jin-Woo swallowed nervously. It was nerve-wracking not knowing what kind of quest he would get, but more than that, he felt excited. When Jin-Woo had been searching for a suitable place to accept the quest using his phone, he'd also looked up information about changing jobs, new skills, progress rewards, job-exclusive weapons, job-related quests, and so on. This was all information from video games, but the general consensus was that changing jobs had tons of benefits. And for me, level 40 was when I could do it. Of course, it wasn't all good news. Jin-Woo also came across some more ominous posts online. What do you do if you chose the wrong job? Shit, if I'd known, I would have picked a different class. I made the wrong decision, so I'm now giving up my favorite game and going back to my boring reality. Do I have to delete my character? Well, that was to be expected when looking through video game forums. Jin-Woo didn't think he had too much to worry about, since he fought almost exclusively using a dagger anyway, and all his skills were reminiscent of an assassin type, like dagger-related skills or stealth. Plus, he'd heavily invested his ability points into strength and agility, so he couldn't imagine getting any job other than an assassin class. With that on his mind, he summoned Kasaka's Venom Fang. The hilt of the dagger fit perfectly in his hand. This feels right to me. He gave a resolute nod. With the weapon gripped tightly, Jin-Woo looked at the message floating in midair. Okay then. Jin-Woo readied himself to face the unexpected and submitted his answer. Would you like to accept the job change quest? Y/N accept. As soon as he did, more messages popped up. Ping. You have accepted the job change quest. The dungeon for the job change quest will now be generated. The dungeon will be generated? Before he could begin to analyze what that meant, things started changing before his very eyes. VMM. A large, dark hole appearing at his feet was just the beginning. VMM. The hole started out the size of a bean, then grew to the size of a coin, then a volleyball, until it was finally big enough for a person to step in and out of. Is that? Jin-Woo stared in wonder. He'd expected to receive another message containing the details of the quest when he accepted, but this. What appeared directly in front of him was nothing short of a gate. It made an actual gate. This was no different from others he'd seen, if a little on the small side. The system sent a message as if prodding him. Please enter the dungeon through the gate. Okay, take it easy. Jin-Woo calmed himself down. Right. If he thought about it, it made no difference whether he entered a dungeon with a key or through a gate. He was just surprised to witness the creation of an artificial gate. He'd only ever entered ones that already existed. He'd never seen any birthed. That was when a new question popped into his head. Wait, can other hunters also enter this? There was no way he could test it. There weren't any other hunters nearby, and he didn't have anyone who would come running at his call, right? Jinho came to mind for a second, but he quickly dismissed that thought. If something went wrong, I wouldn't be able to handle the consequences. The message flashed again as if impatient. Ping. Please enter the dungeon through the gate. The chime snapped him out of his thoughts. He slapped his cheeks with both hands to get his head back in the game. Can't get distracted now. If he succeeded in this quest, he would be able to change his job and reap the benefits. He had no idea what would happen if he failed. It was time to focus. Phew! Jinwoo let out a deep breath, held Kasaka's venom fang in a reverse grip, and leaped down the gate. You have entered the dungeon. Huh? Jinwoo went in expecting the worst, but to his surprise, there was nothing there. It was an average cave-like dungeon. It's just the same. He'd heard that some higher-level dungeons were portals to the other world, so he'd been apprehensive. Thankfully, his worry was unfounded. Instead, he received a peculiar message. Ping. In this area, potions and access to the store are forbidden, and you will not recover your stats when leveling up. Jinwoo confirmed there were no magic beasts in the vicinity, and put away his dagger. Looks like this won't be easy. Perhaps because the quest was for a job change, there were tons of restrictions. Not being able to recover his stats using potions or level ups was alarming. That means damage is going to add up. If he got wounded, it could all be over. Since he couldn't heal, he would have to exercise extreme caution. I can't afford to lose focus. Jinwoo closed the inbox and, as usual, tested the exit. You cannot exit until the job change process is complete. The message came up as soon as he touched the gate. He pushed with all his might, but it wouldn't budge. Jinwoo withdrew his hand. It's blocked. A dungeon of unknown rank, no stat recovery, and no exit. This was a high-risk dungeon. Even the bravest hunter would tread lightly here. But high risk isn't the end of the world. He had learned through experience that the higher the risk, the higher the reward. If the restrictions were any indication, didn't that mean there would be an incredible prize at the end of the tunnel? There was only one way to find out. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Jinwoo took a step forward. He looked ahead and could see only an endless cavern. He couldn't sense any magic beasts nearby. Should I refer to them as monsters, since I'm in a system-generated dungeon? Though the fact that they were creatures was the same. Besides that, there was one more difference. Torches lined the cave wall. Torches instead of glowstones, huh? Unfortunately, torches weren't the best light sources, so despite the sheer number of them, it still wasn't enough to illuminate the whole place, leaving shadows creeping here and there. The mixture of shades and stillness made this dungeon more dismal than others. I can see fine, but the problem was the atmosphere of the place. Jinwoo pulled out the nearest torch and held it in front of him. The path seemed to brighten. Much better. Jinwoo smiled with satisfaction. He gave a quick glance behind him before extending the torch to light the way ahead and moving farther in. How long had he been walking? After quite a while, he came across a turn in the road and sensed multiple presences around the corner. Finally, Jinwoo carefully put down the torch and stood upright. A dagger replaced the torch in his right hand. He briefly entertained the idea of using the stealth skill to get this over with quickly, but dismissed the thought after remembering how much mana it ate up. He wasn't allowed to use potions to replenish his mana here, and he didn't want to waste it, leaving himself vulnerable at a crucial moment. It's coming. Jinwoo pressed his back against the wall and waited for the enemy to turn the corner. Clunk, clunk. The creature's footsteps made an almost metallic sound that drew closer. Clunk, clunk. Jinwoo furrowed his brow at the unfamiliar noise. Does it have a weapon made of chains? He was curious but curbed his impatience. He'd find out soon enough. 5, 4, 3. He reversed his grip on his dagger and held his breath to avoid alerting his enemy with his breathing. 2. 1. Clunk, clunk. The monster's shadow was finally visible. 0. At the end of his countdown, the creature appeared in view. Jinwoo aimed for its neck. Clang. The sound of metal on metal rang, and the dagger didn't penetrate. Armor? Jinwoo's eyes bulged, and he took a step back as he processed what he'd attacked. A human? It was a knight sporting full-body armor, face hidden behind a helmet. Jinwoo called out just in case. Hey! The knight didn't respond but rushed straight at Jinwoo. Thud, thud, thud. The knight charged, shoulder extended, but Jinwoo easily avoided the attack by twisting out of the way. Unable to curb its momentum, the knight came to a halt a ways behind Jinwoo. Maybe it's not human. After being so close to the knight, Jinwoo was certain. He couldn't sense a heartbeat as would have been the case with a normal person. The knight didn't seem human. It was a type of magic beast. No, a monster he'd never seen before. It was covered in armor from head to toe. But it really feels like. Jinwoo couldn't shake the feeling he was fighting a person. Shing! The knight turned and drew its sword. It seemed to share Jinwoo's intention of killing its opponent. Sensing the mutual hostility, Jinwoo sharpened his gaze. Dash! Your speed has increased by 40%. He who strikes first wins. Jinwoo moved in before the monster could. Whoosh! Jinwoo avoided the knight's hasty swing and took multiple stabs at the armor. Clang, clang! But he didn't inflict any damage. The armor's too thick. Not only was it thick, but the surface was smooth, making Jinwoo's dagger merely glance off. The knight swung its sword horizontally. Whoosh! Jinwoo ducked and narrowly avoided getting struck in the head. Since the knight swung so wide, there was a big gap in its attack, a perfect opening. Jinwoo got closer and focused all his power into this attack. Fatal strike. Shunk. The tip of the dagger pierced the knight's armor. Did it work? But it was as if nothing had happened, and the knight slammed its blade down at full power. Shwung. Jinwoo threw himself out of the way. Clang. The sword struck the ground, casting sparks. Jinwoo moved back and found his footing again. His dagger was still stuck in the creature's side. Tisk! He clicked his tongue. It's not that high level. That was his objective evaluation. The knight moved slowly because of its armor, and its attack patterns were simple. The only thing it had going for it was that its defense against bladed weapons was off the charts. Jinwoo rolled up his sleeves. Impenetrable skin? Been there, done that. His confidence came from a previous encounter. The boss monster Blue Venom Fang Kasaka had broken a mana-powered steel sword with a single headbutt, but Jinwoo had managed to defeat that gigantic snake. Compared to the Kasaka, this knight is, well, the reassuring thought brought a tiny smile to his face. Thud, thud, thud. The knight trusted its armor and charged at Jinwoo again. See? It's a simple creature. The hunter easily dodged the knight's shoulder and moved behind it to put it in a headlock. KRRK. Of course, the creature's armor also protected its neck and kept it from being suffocated. KRRK. Jinwoo's muscles bulged, and his veins popped out as he squeezed with all his might. His aim wasn't to strangle the knight. He gritted his teeth hard and put all his strength into it. As he did, crack! The knight's helmet popped off with a terrible noise. Jinwoo was finally putting his over 100 strength stat to good use. Got it! With its head separated from its body, the knight dropped to its knees, lifeless. Thud. You have defeated a knight. A short and sweet message appeared to signal the end of the fight. Something sparkled on the knight's armor to indicate the presence of loot, But Jinwoo's attention was elsewhere. What? There's nothing inside? The helmet in his hand was empty. Just in case, he checked inside the armor, but that was empty as well. So I fought a moving suit of armor? As he reached that conclusion, 2 more knights rounded the corner. They were rather late to the fight. Clunk, clunk. The knights, or rather, the suits of armor, drew their swords in unison upon discovering Jinwoo. Shing! Shing! Jinwoo tossed the helmet aside and warmed up his neck and shoulders. He already knew how to deal with these adversaries. This is where it starts. Thud, 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 thud. Jinwoo smirked at the charging knights. The first stage of this dungeon would be a piece of cake. Perhaps it was because of all the restrictions, but the rate of item drops was quite high. Jinwoo had defeated only 3 knights, but 2 had each dropped an item, which made the current rate 66.6%. He'd never seen such a high drop rate anywhere else. Instance dungeons usually yielded a few miscellaneous items or things to sell in the shop. You have discovered item, high-rank knight's chestplate. Would you like to acquire it? Of course I would. The equipment vanished off the headless knight that remained kneeling and materialized by Jinwoo's feet. Clunk. The information screen for the chestplate appeared. Item, high-rank knight's chestplate. Acquisition difficulty, B. Category, protective gear. Physical damage reduction, plus 7%. If strength is under 80, movement speed will decrease. An additional physical damage reduction by 7%. Combined with his current stats, he could decrease any physical damage he took by 27%. If I can get it to 100%, does that mean I'd be impervious? He considered the possibilities for a moment until it sank in that a B-rank item gave a 7% reduction. It wasn't like the percentage for an A-rank item would suddenly go to 30 or 40%. Taking that into account, reaching 100% seemed to be a lost cause. Still, every little bit helps. If he kept at it, the continuous stat buffs could become an extremely powerful tool. He'd already had Jinho demonstrate the usefulness of quality items. How do I use this thing? He picked up the chestplate, and as expected, he received a message about equipping the armor. Would you like to put on item, high-rank knight's chestplate? The chestplate was a heavy piece of metal that would have been awkward to wear in daily life. If he hadn't tried on the warden's collar before, he would have spent a considerable amount of time deliberating before resigning himself. But that wasn't the case. Yes. Ping. You have put on item, high-rank knight's chestplate. The equipment vanished from his hands, and Jinwoo called up the stat window to check the result. Physical damage reduced by 27%. It worked. He placed a hand on his chest, but couldn't feel the heavy piece of armor. He tried moving around, but still couldn't feel a difference. It was exactly like when he had put on the warden's collar. Great. Next, Jinwoo turned his gaze to the knight he'd left crumpled in a corner. It was so badly damaged that it didn't look like it had anything salvageable, but a telltale glow indicated it held an item. You have discovered item, leather pouch. Would you like to acquire it? Jinwoo felt a little guilty for the destruction he'd wrought on the knight. He wasn't used to fighting barehanded and had trouble controlling his own strength. With a solemn expression, Jinwoo approached the knight and extended his hand. Acquire. You have opened item, leather pouch. It contains 30,000 gold. You have acquired 30,000 gold. Huh? He'd expected the pouch to appear in his hands, but he'd instead received the gold directly. Was this item somehow different from the usual ones? He checked his inventory and was amazed to see that 30,000 gold had been added to his balance. Balance, 863,400 gold. I got a whopping 30,000 gold. Maybe it was because knights usually carried around more items? He recalled how, in video games, the player would often acquire more by defeating human-like monsters over other creatures. Thinking about it, it made sense that one would get more items from a human being than an animal or an insect. It was possible this rule of thumb was being reflected in this situation as well. In any case, this was welcome news. He was saving up gold to buy items from the shop, so a find like this was a big help. Is there anything else I can take? People often say that there's no end to humanity's greed. Jin Woo set aside his main reason for being here and inspected the knights with avarice shining in his eyes. All the suits of armor were worthless, as he crushed them in battle, but the swords caught his eye. I can work with those. The swords looked shiny and brand new. Since they weren't daggers, he had no plans to use them himself, but he figured he could sell them in the shop. If that was a no-go, he could always make a pretty penny selling them to hunters. Jin Woo picked up a sword, but as soon as he did, it quickly rusted over and crumbled through his fingers. Oh! It happened in the blink of an eye. Is this because it's not an item I'm allowed to take? That was too bad, but there was nothing he could do about it. Jin Woo dusted off his hands and picked up the torch he put down earlier. He turned the corner where the knights had been lurking and saw that the path continued on, with no end in sight. He still had a long way to go. It was like reviewing his notes for a test. It was a funny comparison, but that was what popped into Jin Woo's head. In the past 2 hours, he'd run into 4 different kinds of monsters within the dungeon: knights, mages, assassins, and archers. Using stealth this time? An assassin suddenly dropped from his radar. Jin Woo didn't panic, but instead increased his perception, and he soon picked up on the presence of someone sneaking up behind him. Clang! He blocked the assassin's dagger with Kasaka's venom fang, sending his assailant stumbling and leaving an opening for a quick counterattack. Venom fang hit the assassin's chest dead center. Shunk! You have defeated an assassin. You have leveled up. The fatally wounded assassin silently disintegrated into a puff of black smoke. Thump! Its leather clothes fell to the ground. Why are all these monsters humanoid? Every time he killed one, it felt like. Jin Woo shook his head. Thankfully, he couldn't see their faces. The knights wore helmets. Assassins and archers wore leather headgear, and mages wore hooded robes. Jin Woo was about to continue along the road when suddenly, flash! There was a burst of light right in front of his eyes. A mage that had been casting under its breath from a hiding spot had completed its spell. Kaboom! Then came an ear-splitting explosion. Alas, by that time, Jin Woo had already made his way behind the mage. Sensing a threat from behind, the panicked mage rushed to cast another spell. But Jin Woo was faster, making a diagonal strike with his dagger. The mage also turned to smoke. Thump! Jin Woo looked down at the empty robe on the ground, then returned his dagger to his inventory. Got hit by one of those attacks once before when I dropped my guard. Jin Woo had actually been on high alert as soon as he had sensed mana coalescing in one area. It was something he'd learned when facing Yuan Zhou's light magic. Jin Woo refused to fall victim to the same attack twice. That was why reviewing notes for a test felt like an apt comparison. And that's not all. He found that he was using a specific stat to defeat each monster. For knights, strength. For assassins, it was perception. Agility for archers, and stamina against mages. If Jin Woo's stats hadn't met the base requirements to face each foe, it would have been harder to deal with him. Without enough strength, he wouldn't have made a dent in the knight's armor. If perception was too low, he would have had a tough time figuring out where the assassins were. I'm really glad I didn't just throw everything into strength. His intelligence stat was still a little low, but as long as he kept an eye on his mana usage, he'd manage. You have opened item, leather pouch. It contains 20,000 gold and a canteen of lukewarm water. You have acquired 20,000 gold and a canteen of lukewarm water. Ji-woo immediately took the canteen out of inventory and gulped down the water. Phew! He could slowly feel exhaustion setting in. How much farther do I have to go? Was there even an end? He put the empty canteen on the ground and placed his hands on his hips. He had been in the dungeon for 3 hours now, and he was both mentally and physically tired. Should I get some rest? Ji-woo sat down against the cave wall. Stats. Pain. Fatigue. 66. His fatigue was nearing a dangerous level. If it went over 70, it would have a negative effect on both his body and mind. He needed to take a power nap and bring it down. Ji-woo rested his head against the wall and quickly dozed off. He was so tired that even in this dangerous environment, he could fall fast asleep. However, SHWK. A sound pierced the air. Time slowed down, and Ji-woo snatched an arrow flying toward him out of the air. THWP. He opened his eyes. In the distance, an archer was reloading its bow. Does that mean I'm not allowed to sleep yet? Ji-woo summoned Kasaka's Venom Fang as he hauled himself to his feet. KRNCH. The knight, now with a severely dented chest plate, slowly slid to the ground. The splayed suit of armor didn't move. Ping. You have defeated a knight. You have leveled up. Although he'd lost the full recovery benefit for now, Ji-woo continued leveling up as he battled the monsters. It was a small comfort despite his exhaustion. Ji-woo looked at the scrape on his fist and clicked his tongue. He could heal if he rested for a time, but the damn monsters wouldn't cut him any slack. At least he was swimming in loot now. Items equipped. Warden's Collar A. High-rank Knight's Chestplate B. Mid-rank Assassin's Boots B. Low-rank Archer's Gloves C. High-rank Mage's Ring B. Besides what he'd equipped, he stored anything else of use in his inventory. A weapon of some kind would have been nice though. Assassins dropped daggers, but they had a similar attack level to Kasaka's Venom Fang and lacked the extra debuff. What did this knight have to offer? Ji-woo reached his hand out to the light. Ping. Item. High-rank Knight's Gauntlets. Acquisition difficulty B. Category. Protective gear. Physical damage decrease plus 3%. Additional effect. Prevents injury to the wearer's hands. If strength is less than 80, movement speed will decrease. Ji-woo beamed as he acquired the gauntlets and wasted no time equipping them. Like the other wearable items, the gauntlets weren't in any way cumbersome, and his fingers still had full range of motion. Excellent. Ji-woo looked up from wiggling his fingers. All the way at the end of the path, he could finally see where the line of torches stopped, blocked off by giant castle gates. It was rare for the boss's lair to have any kind of door. It brought to mind the underground temple dungeon from not too long ago. Back then, they hadn't known what to expect, and too many people had paid dearly. But that was then, and this was now. He looked back in the direction from which he'd come. It took almost 6 hours to get here. He had reached level 45 and was equipped to the teeth. All his preparations were complete. As much as he wanted to rest and replenish his HP, monsters would only interrupt him if they knew he was trying to sleep. He couldn't afford to attract monsters and risk increasing his fatigue. HP 4, 511/8 330. MP 660/790. Fatigue 43. Let's finish this. Jinwoo checked his stats one last time, and then gripped the door handles on each gate. Kriya, as if rigged to some mechanism, the massive doors swung open at his touch.